Hi there, and welcome to the Untold Radio Network's Down South Anomalies. My name is Jay Katz. I'm joined by my astounding wife, Aspasia.
Jay, we are broadcasting on stolen land, so let's acknowledge the traditional owners, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging.
Absolutely. Now, this is episode 12, and it's a rather interesting, unique episode. It is called Roswell, the In-Depth Down Under interview, and you're probably wondering, they're in charge of the Southern Hemisphere. Why are they going to Mexico? Well, Don Schmitt, I'd say the greatest living historian on Roswell to date, and that's because Stanton Friedman, one of our great nuclear physicists and early ufologists, has passed away, and I think Don has picked up the mantle.
He has.
He was touring Australia in 2019, and we got to have an incredible
Very
of candid, intimate interview here in the archives that looks very shambolic on screen, and quite possibly because it has its moments where it gets order and chaos, just like anything else.
Yeah.
Now, the Roswell Incident has become ubiquitous.
It has.
It's at a point now where it seems to use a line of Don's, it sort of takes the air out of a room because in a way it has everything to it. People are led to believe this has got to be the ET hypothesis, and that's not necessarily so. But there is so many eyewitnesses that Don Schmitt has actually interviewed, and they're first and second-hand eyewitnesses, that the totality of the evidence to support the claims around Roswell being an exotic and absolutely anomalous event are astounding. They really are. And I don't know how latter-day researchers can actually turn this event into something as prosaic as the official Pentagon explanation, which they delivered 2 massive manuscripts on. And they got a bit of the time and the date wrong there. I mean, their notion of crash test dummies, I don't think the deployment of them was anywhere in the 40s. I
It
think
was
it was
in
in the early
1997 that they put that one out, the crash test dummy theory.
yeah,
wasn't
that
it?
was the second massive report.
Anyway.
But I don't think they were deployed to the early 50s. So they even got the technical material wrong. And, you know, as I state to Don, this is Shakespearean. Who doth protest has certainly got to be deceiving somewhere down the line.
Can I just say that that whole thing about, Roswell taking the air out of the room, when we heard about him coming out and lecturing with, I thought, okay, Roswell, I know the story pretty much. But after the first lecture that he delivered, I was like, man, if you haven't heard Don Schmitt speak on Roswell, you don't know the Roswell story.
He's a meticulous researcher, and he initially went into this as a skeptic under the auspices of J. Allen Hynek's Center for UFO Studies. Now, Don is meticulous. I'd say he's on the level of like your classic hard-boiled detective.
He does give us a bit of dirt on J. Allen Hynek too, doesn't he?
Oh, well, I don't know if he gives us dirt. There's a little Chinese whispers I don't know if we can go into.
Well,
and there's
not
no
dirt,
real dirt on
Hynek. Some intimate, private sort of information that's not out in the public domain.
Yeah, so, I mean, don't rush to bury Roswell as a prosaic event.
No.
And in many ways, we should hang our coattails on Roswell, the great work that Stanton Friedman did. No matter what happened to William Moore and Charles Berlitz, there is always chaos in the midst of complete order, as we were saying about the archives.
Absolutely.
And there will always be these hiccups along the way. Donna's had some controversial moments with the Roswell slides and things like that. But when you're an investigator, you can actually, your auspices is to follow the leads.
Absolutely.
And sometimes those leads can take you down the wrong path. And that is no reason to actually then criticize the massive amount of research.
You can veer back onto the right path, can't you?
Yep.
There's always that
Now,
option.
UFO Crash was a seminal book in 1991, followed by The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell, authored with his partner, Kevin Randell. And I think that those 2 books, in a way, changed the nature of contemporary ufology. You know, he's authored quite possibly 15, maybe onto his 16th book now on the subject matter. But the interesting thing to me about Roswell is in the mainstream world, none of us heard about Roswell to the late 70s.
Absolutely.
And we heard in the medium that the mainstream actually knew about through the great Lansbury production of In Search
Oh,
Of,
yes,
hosted
yes.
by Leonard Nimoy. Now,
Very
on that
seminal TV series, that
incredible
for
TV
all
series,
things
and every time they've
anomalous.
tried to remake it, and they did it recently, it's never going to work without Leonard Nimoy, and it's never going to work when it's out of that 70s, origins.
It was
and
a particular time for that sort of stuff back then, wasn't it?
Yeah. And I think you can go back now, and that stuff's been mastered onto DVD,
Yes, it has.
and the
Nice
entire
box set.
I think there's 144 episodes.
Yeah.
Anyway, really worth a look at. But
Mm-hmm.
what I'm stating there is the Lieutenant Jesse Marcel.
Lieutenant Colonel.
Yes,
Yeah.
Jesse Marcel, who was in charge of being the person that would spot for any exotic material that could be a threat to national security. Because what you're talking about is the base that had nuclear ordnance.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the only bases, if not the only
509th bomber, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Yes.
in the
Out
world.
of New Mexico.
Yeah, where the Enola Gay flew out of.
Yep.
So I mean, this was no ordinary base. And I believe in the build-up, 1947 was a huge year of UFO flaps. And they were so paranoid about things flying around that area that they actually had radar operators sitting behind radar operators. So if that guy got edgy, needed to go to the toilet, needed a sandwich break, a cigarette break, there was someone instantly on that screen because there was so much activity occurring. There had been photographs of the aeriform object just days prior to the Roswell incident. All sorts of things were happening. But the one thing that makes me think there's some veracity to the claims of Roswell being a truly astounding, anomalous, and extraordinary event is the fact that the lid was shut on it so
tightly, yeah.
And no one really whispered about that case. Now, let's remember, this was a case that, it's not Jane and Joe Doe here. It's not the proletariat here.
No.
This is a case in which the Air Force itself released a press release stating that they had captured an anomalous object.
Why would they have done that?
Well, you know what? And
so they find a debris field, supposedly
with balsa wood.
Wide of balsa wood,
aluminium foil,
and elastic bands,
and a bit of sellotape with some hieroglyphs on it.
And so what they do is they go, I think we found a flying saucer.
Yeah.
So we better put out a press statement.
Yeah.
Now,
over a weather balloon.
But how does all these high ups? Because this press statement didn't come from the low downs. It comes from high up.
Even though
from the
people
generals
have really attacked Walter Holt.
Yeah.
And he was the public information officer. Yes.
He's not the one who went, I think I'll just put out a press release on this and see what happens. That comes down from generals. They would have had a huge conference about it.
Ratified over and over again. I mean, when I did television, it needed to pass, a script needed to pass several hands with the ticked off.
Let me finish. So these people, these generals that know everything that's flying up there, that's theirs, right?
Yes.
They look at this stuff, bit of aluminium foil, balsa wood and elastic bands and go, oh yeah, this is a UFO. Who were they employing? Seriously.
Even if it was the Mogul balloon, which they later on stated,
Yeah, but they would have known what the Mogul balloon
which had a bit of
like.
exotic material on it, which was evidently just a microphone, right?
Okay, yeah.
How can that cover a square mile? How can that be a square mile? Moving closer to me. We're losing part of your image there.
It just befuddles me that when people actually debunk and just say there's nothing to it. It's like, no, there's something to it, because if the Defense Department, if the Air Force didn't come out and make this statement, nobody would have known anything. Mac Brazel would have gone into town, taken in that material, and then it would have died down. Or they could have gone in and just confiscated all that material, and nothing would have been said. There wouldn't have been all these blaring, headlines across the papers all over.
I think you hit the nail on the head, because the rancher that drove into town with the pickup truck, he's not stupid either. And do you think he's going to spend days on the road and not tending his ranch, where he didn't have a phone, he didn't have electricity and amenities?
Yeah.
He's not going to tend to that ranch and whatever he's got on that ranch for a weather balloon, for a bit of sellotape. He's just going to bury that in the ranch and forget about it.
He would have looked at that material and gone, oh, some aluminium foil, some balsa wood, and some elastic bands, and they just kept walking. Seriously.
Yeah. And you know what? He
Ooh,
got into
look,
town.
a UFO. I better take it into town.
He went into the radio
away.
station.
You
I think at that
morons.
stage, the Air Force realized the cat's out of the bag.
Yeah, no.
And what we've got to do is say, this is our property.
Yeah, this is,
and claim it by saying,
that's
look,
right.
we've taken
It's
it
a
into our
UFO
possession.
and we want it. Yeah, exactly.
But a lot of people want to think that it's still a prosaic event. And that's
Sure.
fair enough.
Mm.
But what you need to do is this. You need to get out into the
Can
field.
I just say quickly? If it was a prosaic event, then it would have stayed a prosaic event. The Air Force wouldn't have made such a federal case out of it, sending in all those people to walk that debris field. And anyone that said that they had any of that material, they went in and they confiscated it straight away.
We're going to hear
they were
so much about
people
that.
were strong armed. They were threatened. They were just, everything under the sun, so that the Air Force could get back every scrap of material that actually was found on that property.
Yeah. Some weather balloon.
Yeah.
Look, we are certainly open. We don't like to take a hypothesis, except at times I really vacillate between,
you kind of got to go
talking to
with
Paul
the evidence.
Wallace the other day.
The evidence, man.
The ET hypothesis hit me again.
Did it?
As a huge possibility.
In the back of the head?
But then reading Ecology of Souls, and thank you so much for the tip of those 2 extraordinary books, 3 actually, with the footnote book, that can take you to somewhere else as well.
Yeah.
I think what we need to do is keep an open mind. But what I was going to say before I was so beautifully interrupted by you,
rudely, you mean,
is it's not up to the philosophers, the theoreticians,
the armchair researchers.
We're not being rude there. I think there's a place for them.
Absolutely.
But it's not up to them.
No.
Ufology is about research and it's about field investigation.
Yeah.
You need to get out there. And believe me, Hajicek was looking into this case, even though that's not something that's publicly divulged to. And he was knocking on door after door after door in ranches in New Mexico. You had Edgar Mitchell state this. He was brought up in Roswell and he was well aware of that event, and it had alluded before his death that there were people high up in the U.S. aerospace program, in the Air Force, in the military, that were well aware that this was an exotic, anomalous incident.
Can I have a chance too?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that there was a paper trail of money spent on.
And we go into that in the interview.
Okay, great. I just to make sure, but just to say they wouldn't have spent, the Air Force wouldn't have spent that much money to get rid of a few bits of balsa wood, aluminium foil, and some rubber bands.
And I'll tell you what, one of the reasons why Roswell to me sings true is the fact that it was suppressed to the late 70s. And through the medium that exists, especially today, of television, the big and the small screen, and look at the impact of Von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods.
Huge.
If that was just a book and not followed by this massive worldwide feature film that was an absolute hit, it would have had less an impact. But it is television that has the money and the resources and the ability to fly into these locations, just like film, that will reveal the truth.
And it has the cachet that everybody wants to be on television.
Yeah.
And people will flock.
But the truth
to be
is
interviewed
here,
for things
that
like
Marcel,
that. They have a story to tell.
Held national security close to his heart for well over 3 decades.
Sure.
And then when the Undertaker appeared, when the Grim Reaper appeared, and Jesse was diagnosed with emphysema, that's when he went on television.
Yeah.
That's when he spoke to Stanton Friedman. And that's, and they wrote the initial book, William Moore, Stanton Friedman, and Charles Bullitt. So it's really important that we actually take all these things into consideration. And if you have a problem with Roswell, please give us the next hour and Don Schmitt candidly and casually and intimately in our archives. And we hope, we don't want to turn you.
No.
It's up to you. But to us, this is no longer, any of this material is a question of belief. Belief does not step into it. If you've got one single witness, then you can dispense with this account. But in its totality, with hundreds of witnesses, some of them and many of them high up in the military with first-hand knowledge, you cannot discount the Roswell incident.
Well, I think if you want to have a better idea of what happened, you actually need to hear all the information. And once you've got all the information, then you can, if you still want to say, I still think it's a prosaic thing, well, then you can go, sure, go for it. But you've got to hear all the
Kenneth
info.
Arnold's sighting was literally just weeks prior to this event.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah,
it was.
So you've got to take into consideration the splitting of the atom, that atomic bomb site, the Enola Gay, what was happening with the radar scopes.
The Enola Gay, the plane
activity.
that flew.
Yeah. So let's have a look at where some of the whispers started to come out around this cake. And this book has been heavily dismissed, Frank Scully's book. And all those people be aware of the X-Files.
Yes.
Yeah, well, that's where Scully's name was taken from, Scully and Mulder.
Yeah.
So, all of a sudden, this person that's never written about any of this material comes out with this extraordinary book of a flying saucer crash.
Yeah, right.
So I'm not going to go into depths of that. Let's just move to the next slide along.
Yeah.
And here's science fiction theatre. 1955. This series thought it was so ahead of its time that it had shoot in colour before colour transmission.
Absolutely.
And that's where it failed. It got into its second season.
Well, it blew its budget there, didn't it?
But I think in the first season, there is an episode about a UFO crash in New Mexico.
Yeah, so it's the science fiction theatre did it take real life events or did it just dramatise?
No, what it always had was about 2 minutes to 3 minutes of real science in the beginning with the host, Truman Bradley.
Yes.
And then it would extrapolate a dramatized plot on top of that.
All right.
So it was unlike One Step Beyond, which did take a lot of real paranormal cases.
Right.
Now, the other person that spoke about UFO crashes is probably one of the most prestigious, well-known and most respected journalists.
She was an amazing journalist, wasn't she?
And she had connections to intelligence agencies, people in the military, people from all over the world. And in 1955, she spoke about a UFO crash.
That's Dorothy Kilgallon.
Yes, you played Dorothy Kilgallon when we recreated the Carousel Club.
Well, she was popping up everywhere in all these very, seminal, events, world events. JFK assassination, Roswell, the crash, Ruby's, confession.
I don't know if Roswell was so much. This is a completely different crash, but it's interesting that a journalist has so much respect and veracity, and she was writing like Richard Kuiper's our friend for Variety there, that she would actually entertain such an idea,
right?
Which is really astounding. Now, we know that Dorothy was one of the people that was actually researching Ruby. Jack Ruby, and she was one of the hosts, one of the permanent hosts of What's My Line.
Yeah.
And you know what? It looks like she was murdered.
Yeah.
And you can go up and watch her final What's My Line, and literally hours after,
she's dead.
She died from an overdose of prescription drugs that you wouldn't believe. You wouldn't even give to an elephant. Yeah. And she won that night. She was on top of her game that night. One of the other things that John Schmitt has alluded to you and I is that if he can, he is going to get us the star of the original Invaders.
That was a great series.
Yeah, that was Larry Cohen created that.
Yes,
one
he
of the
did.
Great kings of exploitation cinema, who did Demon or God Told Me To, which is another fascinating film. If you're not aware of that, that really early in the piece alluded to
abduction
UFO
scenario.
abduction. Yeah, totally.
And it's very, very confronting, that one.
So you remember the Invaders? They all had that sort of
little pinky.
Broken pinky.
Yep.
And there's Roy Finnis, the star.
Yeah.
The saucer there was based on the Adamski craft, which could have been an egg catcher. We're not too sure at this point.
Or an egg hatcher.
Yeah, not that we want to denounce the contactee movement, because I'm sure there's some truth somewhere in the ramblings of that one, even though it was used so extensively to debunk ufological work. And there's the aliens themselves. And here's the Whitman book that I've always loved as a child. Roy Finnis evidently with his wife just days, it might have been weeks, prior to the initial airing of the pilot, had a incredible UFO sighting. And wanted to go publicly with it, but his wife, being very much like you,
pragmatic,
but also reality-based, said you will destroy all your credibility. You might even harm the series. So don't talk about this.
Don't say a word.
But later on, he formed a friendship with Don Schmitt because he was very interested in UFO studies, maybe initiated through this series. And I mean, even Larry Cohen himself, there was a disc brought out when they finally remastered this show. There was
the Invaders.
There was, they released it. I hate the way they release things in tiers, the season
they
one,
want you to buy
season two. But when they released it completely,
the box set,
they had an extra additional disc. And on that disc had incredible commentary. And evidently one of the cameramen that worked on that supposedly knew a lot about the Roswell event and might have been a military cinematographer. You'll have to check it out on that actual
Do we
commentary.
Have that?
We don't. I've got a copy of it, but we need to get the original.
Of course we do. We need to buy something else.
The other thing is that Roy Thinnis ended up being an investigator for a short while under the jurisdiction and assistance of Don Schmitt for MUFON.
Oh, really? Okay,
so
there you go.
He wanted to investigate some cases himself.
I tell you
so
what,
hopefully,
we need to get onto him quick because is he in his late 80s, early 90s?
80s, and he's not well. And we wish him the best
We're chasing
of health.
The Undertaker here.
No,
anyway.
Don't say that about Roy. But hopefully, if we're able to pull it off, and we've sent the messages out there. We will have Roy Thinnis on Down South Anomalies.
Bit of art imitating life or life imitating art.
Yeah, and we're going to have to twist that to make sure that the Northern Hemisphere becomes part of the Southern Hemisphere.
We're all one people, aren't we?
Now, a very close friend, and I didn't realise this during the interview, was the extraordinary late, great Jim Mars.
Really?
Yeah. To Don Schmitt. Very close. And you'll find out in the interview why. And it's linked in with the Roswell event, which is so fascinating.
Wow.
Now, Jim Mars was the inspiration for Oliver Stone's JFK.
Absolutely.
It was this book, Crossfire, which really ignited the flame in Oliver Stone. And there's an interesting story. I don't want to be a spoiler here in the interview.
Don't be.
That's about this and the Roswell movie. So we'll leave that to be
You need to watch it.
Now, this book is one of our favorite books. I remember when we were, driving long distance one day, we were reading chapters of this book to each other and having epiphanies and nearly driving off the coast road because of it. But I reckon if you really want to see the heart of Jim Mars, it wasn't just his JFK research, which was second to none. It's his research into the alien agenda.
Right. Yes.
And this is a great book, absolutely extraordinary book. So let's have a little peek at Jesse himself, which I believe Jesse is a real hero.
Yeah.
And his son, who always maintained that his father, who had actually, because this material was so exotic, had actually driven to the house to show his wife and Jesse Jr. this material. You're not going to do that if it's weather balloon.
No.
You're not going to break every security requirement. You're going to do it if it's something that you're never going to see again.
Exactly.
And he knew that was going to disappear. And look, please go and search out In Search Of.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And there's a picture of Jesse. Those final stages when he appeared
In Search Of.
In Search Of.
Yeah.
So I think really it's an absolute joy to put this interview up on air. We have to we have to thank a friend of ours, Campbell Drummond, who really went to a great extent to make this occur.
To put it together and he's very professionally.
Yeah, the cinematographer, he's the editor, he's the composer. That's his music that you'll hear. And he's the person that did the overlay.
Yeah.
And Campbell is a one-person film crew.
He is.
So I suggest we're going to put up at the very end. It's not. He hasn't got a website anymore. We're going to put up in our notes to this interview where to contact him.
That's right. If
you're ever traveling to this country, please do that to at least thank him for putting this interview together for us. Well, without that incredible work, we wouldn't have this moment in time captured.
Exactly.
So you're on Down South Anomalies.
You
We're
are.
taking a little different path, but we've got some very interesting guests coming up in the future.
We do.
Paul
so
Wallace
definitely stay tuned. Yes.
is definitely coming on.
Yeah.
We've got the gentleman from Mysterious Universe have
Yep.
confirmed they're going to be
Yes.
in a couple of months' time, and boy, is their site second to none.
Absolutely.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
And we have the return of Australian Yowie hunters,
Yes, we
Gary
do.
and
The
Buck,
boys, yeah.
who were there that
were there,
night
yeah.
when Dean captured that 9-foot thermal image of our Bigfoot down under, the Yowie.
Yeah, lots to look forward to.
Yes, so thank you for being with us. Sit back and relax and listen to the incredible research, the integrity, the decency of Don Schmitt.
Now, this might be a bit dodgy because this is the first time I've done this one. So
yeah, but
hang in
okay.
there.
You don't need to state that. We'll get through it.
I just want people to know, what's
that
happening.
we're evolving here.
Yep.
Every time we're evolving.
And we're ready to go?
Yes, let's do it.
Here we are.
Welcome, Don Schmitt, to Australia.
How much of a great time I've been having so far. Finally meeting people such as yourself, Jamie, and you have been so overly kind and flattering that I'm more than humbled. So.
Well, I'm very humbled by your integrity as an investigator,
Thank you.
a writer, and a producer now. It's 2019. We're looking at 72 years since the Roswell event.
Exactly. Yes.
Maybe if you can take us back very quickly to where Roswell started for you. You were a field investigator working with the extraordinary J. Allen Hynek.
Correct. And little did we know that he himself was starting to dabble in Roswell. When he left Chicago, and in his last 2 years of his life, he lived in the Scottsdale, Arizona region. And when he had retired from Northwestern University as the head of the astronomy department, they had willed him an old abandoned observatory in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, western portion of the state. Been there a number of times. It's like a one-horse town, that type of thing. And whenever he would spend some time with a former student by the name of Elaine Hendry, and they would travel over to New Mexico, they would go a little bit further in the Lincoln County. Allen was actually speaking to some of the old ranchers and their families and hired hands, and he would write notes as to what they would discuss. So after he passed away in 1986, we find all those handwritten notes talking to these Roswell witnesses about 1947. And in Allen's bold notation at the top, this needs to be followed up.
Now, you went in initially
as a skeptic.
As a skeptic. Tell us a little bit about that.
I had talked to Stanton Friedman, the true pioneer, the true father of Roswell as an investigation goes. And I approached him about whether he felt the case had been wrapped up, if they had taken it as far as they could. And that's when I was surprised that he would absolutely not. Oh, no, Donna. I'm sure there are potentially hundreds of witnesses still out there. Fully confident we would prove this was a weather balloon or something just as prosaic, just as conventional. And little did we know. And in the first couple days, that appeared to be the case. We were talking to second, third-hand witnesses that really couldn't give us any hard, anecdotal testimony. And then by the time we actually got into Roswell, and we would meet with Walter Hott, the public information officer from the Roswell Army Airfield from 1947. And then we would meet with Bill Brazel. And to listen to Bill describe the handling of the wreckage, what it was like to him, And I had already prepared probably 3 pages of questions just regarding the wreckage. And we became just all the more inspired as to, my God, what if this was indeed the genuine article? And you held it. And his wife Shirley describing, in detail the same thing. And you both held it. And then the admiration started to become envy, jealousy for the fact that they held something that we then set our sights on. We needed to also have such an opportunity in life to actually handle something that may have been manufactured off the planet. My God. And we couldn't get back to New Mexico fast enough. We were back in April. And by September, we already had put together the first archaeological dig, where we mapped, laid out a systematic grid over the area. We marked areas of potential entrapment because we wanted to make every effort to experience what Bill and Shirley Brazel had described, to actually hold a piece of a genuine flying saucer.
Now, I think you've done 3 digs, but
Five.
Five digs,
yes.
And you're still going. There's still future digs to occur.
We're going back beginning in December with more electronic equipment, more subterranean radar, and cover a much wider area. And then in spring, I'm hoping to go back with a full team.
Those first 2 books were groundbreaking. I think they changed. They're another uplift in ufology. They changed the nature of the way we perceive that event. And they were written in tandem with Kevin Randell.
Oh, of course.
Can you tell us about your relationship, just briefly, how you two came together to work on those 2 books, which is UFO Crash and The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell?
And we came together quite serendipitously. I was invited to speak and then participate in a debate at a science fiction conference. And Kevin Randell just happened to be there. And we became immediate, good friends. I felt we did very well as far as in the debate, the 2 skeptics, as they were, for not knowing much about the subject. It was pretty much, well, show me, prove it to me. Till I hold the piece in my hand, there's nothing you can say that's going to convince me otherwise. Well, we had yet to, make that first trip to New Mexico. And then when I approached Kevin, because I felt not only with his military background, he was a captain in Air Force Reserves at that time. I didn't want a fellow ufologist. I didn't want somebody from the Center for UFO Studies. I felt, with my skepticism, let's go with somebody who was just as skeptical. And the rest is history.
And that military background in many ways assisted in furthering that research,
yes.
I'd imagine.
But, interesting to note, I was working with someone on the side who also had an Air Force intelligence background. And within the next couple years, we came up with 300 more witnesses.
I have always thought about your research that you come at this like a very credentialed detective. This is beyond Ellery Queen.
Yes, yes.
So is that been your approach all along?
Totally. But investigating a crime minus a crime.
You're as good as just about anyone who's out there writing about any of these things, these real-life cases.
Thank you.
How many books have you authored so far?
Co-authored or authored 15. 15.
Wow.
15.
Wow. And was the first book UFO
Crash at Roswell, which
1991
became the impetus of the movie Roswell.
And that is an astoundingly brilliant film.
I love the film.
It's not just highly entertaining. It has 2 of my favorite actors in it, and I think it's just beautifully done. It's meticulous. And I'd say that's the work of yourself behind the scenes, plus the director, Paul Davis.
Kevin used to tell me that, Don, when we arrive on the set, because we were also then technical consultants, we filmed not in New Mexico, as far as the exteriors. We filmed in Bisbee, Arizona. Quaint little town with wonderful architecture, winding streets, and it was perfect. It set the theme, it set the background. And then to have a cast and crew that was just, they were like children in a candy store, whether it was Martin Sheen or Dwight Yoakam or Bob Gooten or Peter McNichol or Charles Martin Smith.
They were curious about the subject matter.
You could not sit down and have a bite without them surrounding you and peppering you with more and more questions. Our director was Jeremy Kagan, and he too, it was a labor of love. You mentioned Paul Davids, our executive producer, and then Arthur Coppett. We had a playwright who did our screenplay, a playwright. And then our score was Elliot Goldenthal, who was a major motion picture composer. And so it all came together so masterfully. To this day, Jamie, I could not be more proud of that film.
And so you should be. Now, the research certainly changed after that. And
totally.
The idea of the story that was laid out in the script of that film has, in a sense, I'll use the word evolved.
Yes.
Evolved to a point of
as
more
investigation
awareness.
Minus a final resolution always should evolve. It should remain fluid. It should remain in a state of flux.
And that notion, we're dealing with one of the most controversial subjects that you could ever see in human history.
Totally.
But if you look statistically at criminal law, the final resolution is not something that always occurs.
That's correct.
Sometimes can be an incredible rarity in criminal law. So it's a matter of getting that eyewitness testimony together. In its singularity, it might feel very insignificant. In its totality, it is profound. And I feel that way about Roswell.
Thank you.
So 2 questions. Do you think it's time for another Roswell feature?
Yes, of course. Absolutely. In fact, the book Witness to Roswell, co-authored by Thomas J. Carey and myself, was the #1 selling UFO book in the world.
It's one of my favorite books in my library.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And we have had more skeptics. I've had more lawyers. I've had judges tell me that that book convinced them, finally. They were on the fence, they were at a crossroads, and then when witness, and that's the key point, because we allow witnesses to speak for themselves. People that we had never printed a word of heretofore, and it presented as far as an argument way beyond anything they had written up to that point.
And this is what I think the mainstream is not aware of. And your approach to this work, from a detective's perspective, from an investigative journalist perspective, has an extremely overt humanistic edge to it. You really care about the witnesses. You speak extensively in your lecture of the trauma they have been through.
Yes.
And if it was something incredibly prosaic as a weather balloon, you would not see that trauma, especially over the number of decades we're looking at now. We still have witnesses, I'm aware of through your research, that are still heavily traumatized today, and their children are traumatized as well because of the threats that were laid on them at the time. It's something I see as a researcher in the field, and I think it's a worldwide thing, that even something coming into contact or beginning to realize that there's a reality to this phenomena, the difficulty of integrating that into their everyday life, the fact that their notion of consensus reality has collapsed. And I couldn't imagine what it would be like to take it another step further and then to be threatened to remain silent.
Yes, yes.
I mean, I see post-traumatic stress disorder because people can't talk to their partners about it. They can't talk to family members about it. They can't talk to the people they work with about it because of the noise attached to this signal.
Which was also by design. They immediately determined that the best way to cover this up, to shut this down, is to create a level of character assassination, of discrediting witnesses, of just creating this self-perpetuating hoax on the part that witnesses wouldn't dare report anything thereafter. They just created such a stigma. They made it such a totally taboo topic. All a result of Roswell. We can document the fact that one of the very arbiters of the cover-up, General Roger Ramey, who had the infamous weather balloon press conference at his very office, going up the chain of command from Roswell. And days later, when he was doing an El Paso radio program, and he's asked by the reporter, well, General, that explains Roswell. It was a weather balloon. What about all the other flying disc reports? Isn't it true they're being reported in every state throughout America? To which General Ramey responds, yes, that's true. Except Kansas, which is a dry state. In other words, they have prohibition. So in other words, only people who over imbibe, only people who drink, even have these experiences. The ridicule factor is born. And the point, I can't emphasize enough, that it was born of Roswell. As Roswell was buried, as they were sticking that final dagger into Roswell, trying to make sure it never came back to haunt them, they also used it to then try to discredit all other flying saucer reports at that time. And I have colleagues to this day that they just won't acknowledge that. They just feel that because Roswell sucks the air out of the room, the moment you mention Roswell, everything else pales because it's all encompassing. It involves not only civilian witnesses, not only military witnesses, but it goes up all the way to Washington, it goes to the Pentagon. And then you're talking about wreckage, you're talking about the remains of a craft, you're talking about remains of biological entities. And then when you throw into the mix also a survivor. And then the linchpin being that famous press release that came out on Tuesday, July 8th, where they actually acknowledged they had captured a flying saucer. Everything else pales in comparison to that. Everything else is fleeting. It's a sighting. Maybe a landing, maybe a photograph, maybe a video. But that's it.
I don't think people, the mainstream, realize the amount of gravity in a military press release.
Precisely.
That this is something that's thought about extensively before it's put out.
How often they try to suggest that, well, the base commander at that time, Colonel William Blanchard, that he was a loose cannon. That's how one of the skeptics referred to him. Loose cannon. He would have been number 2 pilot in the B-29 boxcar, which dropped the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki.
And you're not going to
he was a loose cannon?
Yeah, you're not going to put a loose cannon in that
And
position
he goes
of command.
on to become a 4-star general by the age of 50. Unprecedented. But he was a loose cannon. So you see, we have to even discredit a 4-star general. And then, well, if that doesn't work, then his press secretary, Walter Hott, well, he took it upon himself to write that. He wasn't authorized to do it. My God, that, he would have been court-martialed.
Would never occur.
Would never have occurred.
Yeah.
Well, if that doesn't work, well, then Major Marcel, the head of intelligence, who went out to investigate the crash site, he took it upon himself to put out the press. You see how they just go out of their way to rewrite history, rewrite the very protocol within the United States military, because they are essentially preying on the gullibility, the naivety of the novice, the layperson, who doesn't know any better. That's why, as you saw, I will often ask, who is military in this room? Because you understand, you'll relate, you'll comprehend. But let me still explain for the others. And that is the ongoing insult, especially to the memory of all the military people who were involved. The fact that they overreacted. They just jumped the gun and they came out with the flying saucer. And then when it was summarily dismissed as being nothing more than a balloon with a radar kite, they had all this egg on their face. And Jesse Marcel, he came back to Roswell from the balloon press conference in Fort Worth with his tail between his legs, and he was never the same. Well, he went on to Washington from there, and he was the one that briefed President Truman on the atomic bomb first being detonated in August of '49 in Mother Russia. He was still good enough to do that. We have to look at the full situation. And we can cherry pick all we want. Oh, the mortician at Roswell, he was having an affair, so that disqualifies him. Or Major Marcel, he only went on to service televisions and radio equipment because that became his specialty after he left the service, so he's not qualified. And Colonel Blanchard, he was a loose cannon. And so we always look for the flaw or the fly in the ointment. We always look for something to disqualify them. And that's, to me, the mission of desperation. I'm not desperate. I allow the evidence to take me where it has. From a total skeptic to the point that now I'm 99% convinced. I'm not a believer, I'm convinced. But if I have to turn the coin on the other side, find the slightest smidgen of testimony from a witness to fall into my mosaic, my puzzle, to make it fit, then I'm showing desperation. I don't have to. All these witnesses say it was the genuine article, it was a flying saucer. And if you have to find a single skeleton in their closet to disqualify them, you're the desperate one, not me.
Exactly. And we're dealing with the human condition.
Precisely.
If you want to have a good look, you'll find skeletons in all our closets.
And the human condition responding to a non-human event.
And that's why people have very clear and precise and traumatized memory. And they would not feel that way about a bit of balsa wood and some sellotape.
Of course not. Not
and
for a
so
second.
I think, in a way, you have struggled across many decades to get one of the most profound stories into the mass mind think, a story that could change the way that humanity treats each other.
Totally.
And if that story is not told, then we have really lost an important part of history.
My God, when I think of just how many of those individuals who were brave enough not to come forward, who were brave enough to trust us, to take us into their confidence, and then finally describe to us something that they felt the world should know about. But then, how many took it with them? How many of the, especially the highest ranking officers who had pensions, who were threatened as far as the very safety of their families and loved ones at that time. They had the most to lose, so they weren't willing to. So they took it with them. Gone forever. There's nothing more finite than death in that respect. And
you've mentioned that many times, that you're literally chasing the Undertaker, especially in these years now.
What other UFO case would you actually apply that terminology? I'm chasing the Undertaker. And what other UFO case has forced the United States government to come out with 2 additional explanations? I defy any of my colleagues, give me an example where the Pentagon has called 2 press conferences to respond to a UFO incident.
Yeah.
Well, they did with Roswell.
And where a skeptical press corps is even laughing in the end at their own explanations.
Laughing. And the Pentagon spokesperson saying, when asked, well, what if the public don't accept the crash dummy nonsense? And he responds, well, then I guess we'll be here in another couple offering another explanation.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, incredibly Shakespearean. He who doth protest, and the more noise you make around that, it'd be better if they stepped back and never said anything.
Precisely.
But you have incredible moments, many of them, and one of them was the senator from New Mexico that said, I'm just going to follow the paper trail. I'm going to see how much it cost to remove a weather balloon.
Yes, yes.
So tell us about Senator, and he passed away, didn't he?
Well, actually, you're talking about Congressman
Oh,
Stephen
right.
Schiff.
Yes, I am. Thank you.
Schiff.
Excuse me.
And because he was stonewalled by the White House, by the Pentagon, specifically the Air Force, because all he was requesting was, I want to see the file. This was an historic event. There was a crash recovery of something. There was a press release. There was a press conference following as far as the incident. Witnesses were questioned. Witnesses are named. I want to see the file. I want to see the report. He sends three separate letters to the Secretary of Defense at that time. Les Aspin. He's ignored. That doesn't happen. I mean, he's a senior congressman with the Senate Appropriations Committee as far as on the armed forces, and he's ignored, like, ask me anything but that. And so he then directs Congress's own investigative unit, the General Accounting Office, as it was called back then, the GAO. And they're not into the actual investigation and the interrogation and interviewing of witnesses. But as you described, Jamie, where they did an accounting. Well, let's see where the money was going at that time. Let's see if there was any special allowances given regarding this balloon recovery back at that time. And let's then ask each branch of the service and departments of intelligence to do a search for their own files, their own records pertaining to the incident in 47. And they came up empty-handed, or so they claim. Only one FBI document regarding that Dallas Bureau office, that telex that went out at 6:17 that evening after the balloon press conference, refuting it, claiming that's not what we've been talking about with our sources at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio at that time, where the wreckage was originally destined for testing and analysis. You know, they're telling us it's a weather balloon. No, it's not. We've been talking about something all together, and it is going on the Wright Field for testing. We don't care what General Ramey says by canceling it. It's still going on for testing and analysis. And so Congressman Schiff is becoming all the more frustrated because he's not getting anything. All these, you know, as far as special departments within the government who should be totally allegiant to the Senate, the Congress of the United States, and they're not cooperating. So then, as Newsweek magazine very aptly put it, as though a preemptive strike, the Air Force has a press conference, and they come out with a new theory. Colonel Richard Weaver announces that, well, yes, ladies and gentlemen, we did lie back in 1947 when we claimed that this was nothing more than a weather balloon, a round target device, neoprene rubber balloon with a radar, a hexagonal radar kite. We lied about that. But we have a new theory that it may have been a special Russian balloon, a spy balloon, called Project Mogul. The concept of the project was that if the Soviets were to detonate the first atomic bomb, we would pick up the sound wave, the shock wave in the upper atmosphere. And Mogul was designed to do that. Same off-the-shelf material, rubber, foil, sticks, string, tape. Materials a 5-year-old child would have recognized. The difference was it had an acoustic listening device suspended beneath it, a sonobuoy, a microphone. And that's what convinced, or that's what confused the very personnel who were in charge of the atomic bomb at that time, the 509th Bomb Group. They saw that microphone and they went, oh my God, We're being invaded. Must be made on another planet. Yeah, okay. And so
they really don't have much respect for their own military personnel if that's the way they're analysing what
that's
occurred
the way
there.
they analyze, and that's the way they try to, sweep it under the carpet. And please, and then they would also put the word out to all the officers in the service, you better agree with this. This is now going to become the official explanation to the 1947 incident. So I'm obviously very concerned at the moment. So I immediately call up Congressman Schiff at his office in Washington, because I thought that he would walk, that he would abandon the project right there. Well, the Air Force says that's all it is. It's good enough for me. And I will never forget, because I met with him. We were sending him material. I would meet with him in his office in Washington. I'd meet with him or his representative, Mary Martinick, who was his chief aide in Albuquerque. And when he picked up the phone when I called, and he says to me, Don, they're a bunch of goddamn liars. Let me get reelected, and then we're going to hit them even harder. I could not have been more proud of Congressman Schiff at that time. And then, as he's running for reelection, and he develops a sore, a rash behind his ear, and it's immediately diagnosed as being melanoma. And within 6 months, 51 years old. So we never did have a second go at it, a second chance.
That's a very fast-acting melanoma, but I'm not going to...
We were told that. In fact, then, some months later, I was contacted by his oncologist in Albuquerque. Wanted me to stop by. Want to sit down with me. Wanted to tell me what the congressman said before he died. And when I arrived back in New Mexico, I immediately called his office, because I thought it would be something quite profound. And that's when the doctor picked up the phone and said, Mr. Schmitt, don't ever call this office again. I have nothing further to say to you. I haven't given up on him.
Good on you. And that's something that's extraordinary in your character, to be able to bounce back in the midst of so many... I mean, ufology itself is such a controversial field. And it seems to awaken that evangelical nature in people. You feel like you're dealing with their very DNA. You're impacting their very DNA. But what astounds me about Roswell, it's not just the Pentagon coming out with these two absolutely absurd reports, but it's also the fact that there must be something to this, because in the middle of it, bang, around that anniversary, we see something as absurd as the alien autopsy make its appearance in public. This has definitely been filmed on a video CCD in a camera. This does not look like film emulsion to me, but this certainly looks like they're trying to muddy the waters to a huge extent. And I believe that military personnel flew in to see that ridiculous 20-minute little preview that Ray Santilli put on in London, wasn't it?
That was in London, and we had already been provided with stills from the video.
Which was nothing.
There were no actual frames of film released.
But even that body was so contradictory to the eyewitness testimony.
And that's where they were hoping, beyond hope, that we would then, they had asked us to take those frames to our witnesses for their reaction, their response, their validation. And there wasn't a one. We knew that. I mean, based on all the sketches, all the descriptions, all the composites that we were even compiling as far as ourselves, when we saw those stills, we saw those images, we thought, not even close. I mean, this is a human body with a distended as far as abdomen, almost like it was a female, and it wasn't a bloating. It was as though it was pregnant, that type of thing. And then the size of the head and the 6 fingers and 6 toes, and then everything about the autopsy itself. I mean, the decontamination unit outfits are self-contained, and back in 1947 they were not. And every incision was made with the hand in the foreground, which is a standard Hollywood ploy, because latex rubber tends to ripple, it puckers as opposed to actual tissue, which is a very precise straight line.
What happened to the lividity of a dead body, where the blood would pull to that center of gravity?
As well.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many things to it, but when I looked at it, I thought there is distinctly money behind this, and this has been put in here to muddy the waters, and the timing of it was just too pronounced.
Or capitalize on the anniversary.
And there's another extremely valid point, because what we're talking about is a very strong signal of reality, of actuality, that is surrounded by a huge percentage of exploitation, apocrypha, disinformation, and to be able to undo that web. I don't know how every day you wake up and think, I'm diving back into the soup of this again.
Because the soup has never reached a boiling point. It has always remained rather tepid. Because as I had been warned at times by high-ranking officials that it would get hot the closer we would get. We saw a wonderful example with the release of the movie. And the military response, specifically when it came out on video, and it became the #1 requested film at military bases all around the world, and how quickly that was shut down. You can't even get the movie on DVD. We had a situation at Wright-Patterson a number of years ago where they had requested the actual surviving prop, the body, the alien from the movie, to coincide with the release of our book on Wright-Patterson, the real Area 51. And Paul Davids calls me up, the executive producer, and he has it in his possession. He has that very anthropoid, that animatronic alien. And Don, should we do it? And I said, well, let's do it with one caveat, one condition. We get to show the movie at the base. And the base commander and then his public relations department immediately responded with a statement. It is not the position of the Air Force to provide information to its personnel that is contrary to their official position.
Well, what about a bit of entertainment for your troops then?
I guess this wasn't considered entertainment.
You know what, I think the only other parallel in a history to do with cinema would probably be Oliver Stone's JFK.
Yes, yes. We had a one-day conference of sorts in Santa Barbara. And that evening, Bud Hopkins and I were the two keynotes at the Lobero Theater in Santa Barbara. And I was approached by a gentleman. His name was either Goldstein or Goldberg. And he even sent me a prospectus, a proposal for a movie on Roswell. And who was he about to approach? Oliver Stone. This was just before he went into development with the JFK movie. Now, he made the right decision. He went with JFK because we all know the impact that movie had.
And it had extraordinary impact, and it had impact in terms of releasing so much information to the public that in a way, painted them into a tighter spot. And I think he realizes now too that There was an evolution in research. Jim Mars's research was reasonable, but after that film, there was so much else, just like Roswell, that came forward. And
But you mentioned Jim Mars.
yes,
Dear friend, gone now 2 years. And how Jim and I came together over Roswell. Because where did Jim originally work? At the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. Who was the photographer that originally took those famous pictures of the weather balloon press conference? James Bond Johnson of the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. And when Jim originally contacted me, that when he was there, he had all form of colleagues who knew officers at the base there at Carswell in Fort Worth, who never talked about balloons, never talked about this being conventional. They even talked about the bodies that came in from Roswell that weren't from this earth. And that Jim was happy to pass that on. And all those colleagues were sadly gone by that time, because you're talking that when he was a cub reporter at the paper, they were already approaching their retirement years. But that as far as Jim was concerned, and as far as the newspaper was concerned, the balloon was the biggest hoax of all time, because it covered up the biggest story of the millennium. It honestly, and then one of the gentlemen, he profusely apologized last night, because he suggested that I was only in this for the money. And then I recited
he should come and watch this Australian tour, you know, if he thinks that way.
And then I cite the example that every time we do an archaeological dig, you're talking tens of thousands of dollars. The equipment, putting up all the people, bringing in the archaeologists, the geologists. I mean, we pay, for their time and effort. Feeding everyone, transporting everyone in and out each day, the petrol, all that. And then the analysis on anything we find. Every time we do a radioisotope test, as far as on the slightest fragment, you're talking $3,000 to $5,000, that type of thing. So I was just going through, I says, you want to trade me? At a time when Kevin Randell and I, when we couldn't rely on the internet, when we actually had to track people down, our phone bills were averaging $1,000 a month between the two of us. And then all the trips to New Mexico on our own dime, month after month, year after year. Nobody was paying us. I said, now tell me, how much of your occupation do you donate? Do you do for nothing? Now, it would be pretty foolhardy to, go to college and everything, and then just like that, yeah, I'm going to donate the rest of my life trying to, investigate something.
Let alone the ridicule, the noise, the anger, the hate, the targeting that is out there.
And not once have I ever thought, I'm going to bail. I'm out of here. I don't need this. Not once.
Well, that's what I respect and admire about you deeply. Now, with Roswell, I can tell that maybe, in a way, there's a template we can take from the Kennedy assassination and place it over Roswell. Because once something works, it's going to be repeated. It's a bit like Edward Bernays and public relations and the repetition in advertising.
In mentioning Jim Mars, and I had read Mark Lane and I believe it's Robert Groden and David Lifton and other researchers, authors on the Kennedy assassination. And Jim Mars was the first one, at least in my opinion, that actually approached it as an investigator. And one of the things that I immediately picked up on, and I was in college at the time, and to see on a big screen the Zapruder film and all its gore, and then to watch in slow motion the head snapping backward, contrary to what CBS reporter Dan Rather testified to with the Warren Commission, you know, I would make such a bald-faced lie, I would be forever banned as a journalist because, you know, to me, it's beyond lying. You're deceiving. You're misleading the world. You're claiming something happened in a film that doesn't actually occur, all because you're assisting them in their cover-up, their deception. But one of the things that came through that I never heard anybody else question before was the opposite side of Dealey Plaza on Elm Street. Across from where Zapruder was standing are dozens of other people watching the approaching presidential limousine, and they too are all holding cameras. They're all filming what then became, or would become, one of the most tragic moments in all of recorded history. And as I did, Jim Marrs was the first one to actually say, did anybody ever talk to any of those other witnesses? Did anybody ever track them down? Did anybody ever make any attempt to acquire any of that film footage? And Jim Marrs did that. And I did that. And I did it with Roswell. Because in other words, wherever your lookout post happened to be, wherever your vantage point was, wherever your perspective happened to be, I felt it important enough to talk to you, track you down. It wasn't where I just, well, they might know something, but it's not important enough. They should know something, but they probably won't talk. It didn't matter. If you were on my radar, I was after you. I was going to provide you with an opportunity to come clean. Have a chance to finally tell the world the reality of what you knew to be the truth. Jim Marrs did that with the JFK assassination, and I sure as hell have done it with Roswell. And that's what I loved about the man. That's what I miss about his own tenacity, the fact that he also left no stone unturned. Sadly, all those films were confiscated at Dealey Plaza. That's what Jim quickly determined. But there again, that became part of the noise factor. That why were the Secret Service agents quickly rushing and pulling, tearing away all those cameras, or reeling out as far as all that film, making sure it would never see the light of day? Speaks volumes.
And I think we look at the Zapruder film today, and that 38 seconds of profound history has gone through extensive analysis and looks like
and
it was
modification.
Modification. It was extremely altered. Some of the best analysis have come out of this country, and it shows that, well, we were technically at a bridging point as far as cinematography went back then. I can remember seeing Mary Poppins around that time.
That's true.
That was a breakthrough in terms of matte imagery.
That imagery, exactly.
And what we're looking at, when we look at the Zapruder film, any of us now can look at and realize, just like the cover of Lee Harvey Oswald, that photograph in the backyard. I mean, here is a person that cried his innocence.
Yes.
Yet a couple of weeks beforehand, he'd ask his wife to take a picture of him with the communist reader and a shotgun in the backyard. A man who's saying, I'm completely innocent, I'm a patsy, doesn't make logical sense.
No.
And so the Zapruder film was not shown to the public, I think, till it was bootlegged around 75. It was Geraldo Rivera that had appeared on TV for the first time through Robert Groden.
Yes.
And I think that the bootlegs had come from Garrison, who'd subpoenaed it to be in the court case he'd done in the late 60s. So he was this astounding
was the
film.
Attorney. Well,
That's
and
right.
in the JFK movie, he was the principal character, the Kevin Costner portrayal of Garrison.
So people spoke about this astounding film. Was there word before even the appearance of that pathetic piece of material by Ray Santilli? Was there word of Roswell, an autopsy film? Was that earlier in the piece?
It was for that reason, because we only assume that certainly once you have unique specimens in your possession,
You're going to
that you're
document that
going
in
to
situ. And the
every
military
second.
would always do that, wouldn't
And
they?
we were able to demonstrate that there were outside photographers, specialists, professional photographers. What's standard procedure in the military, at least back then, was when they would assign you to different units. When it came to the 3rd photo lab at Roswell, it came down to, has anybody in this room ever taken a picture? Photo lab, photo lab, photo lab, photo lab. You were far from professional. And the 3rd photo lab at Roswell happened to have over 100 men in it, because they walked all around Roswell with cameras around their necks, because it was just a front, it was a cover, because they weren't really photographers, but it was their way of slipping and easing into society. And especially they're concerned about the Soviet spies, who were not Soviet. They typically were Mexicans that were slipped across the border, with the Russians waiting, on the other side for any information they could bring back. And so the fact that they were recording every moment of the entire recovery operation demonstrated to us that they then would make every effort to determine what the biological makeup, inside and out, would be of these beings, these entities, these bodies recovered at the crash site. The Roswell Base Hospital at that time did not have a morgue. So, we're learning details, and we're getting plats, layouts of the base hospital, where the operation room was, where the examination rooms were, where the loading dock, where they would have actually entered, brought bodies in, and where they would have had to go. So in other words, based on those locations, who would have been assigned, who would have been the administrator, who would have been his secretary, the nurses. In other words, we tracked down everyone who was, or we made an attempt to track down everyone who was in the medical squad at that time. And if it was somebody who worked in supply down on the other wing, who was not even connected to the operation room, isn't it interesting that that's the one that the government brought out, who said, I never saw anything. Nothing ever happened here. Well, you had your head in a cloakroom, in a supply room, removed as far as by 3 different buildings. So I'm sorry, you weren't there. And you would have had absolutely no need to be involved. So that's all you're acknowledging, is that you were just some lowly staff member who they wouldn't have called on, even if they needed clean sheets. So we then had information that St. Mary's Hospital, with their nursing staff, when there would have been special need, that their nurses were also then called in to assist. We had the Ballard Funeral Home just up Main Street from the main gate. They were on call. They also had a special contract with the base hospital. Their hearse served even as the local ambulance through Roswell, and they would be waved as they would drive in if they had any military personnel that needed medical care. Bring it through. And so there was this interaction between the Roswell Army Airfield Base Hospital and St. Mary's Hospital and the Ballard Funeral Home. So then we're tracking down, and we're trying to find out who all worked at St. Mary's in that capacity, who all worked at the Ballard Funeral Home in that capacity. Ballard Funeral Home even had its own nurses, and they performed autopsies there. And we have good reason to believe that one of the bodies was taken there. And there was a preliminary autopsy done because, quite simply, they had the equipment. They had the surgical tools to perform an autopsy. The base hospital at Roswell did not. And so that's where, again, this remaining in this state of flux, in trying to, again, always go where the evidence, the testimony takes you. Science makes the mistake when so often they have a preconceived theory and then they set out to prove it. There's nothing scientific about that, as opposed to, I'm just going to go where the evidence takes me and then make a determination based on that evidence?
Now, science can't walk into this conundrum without some detective work to begin with. It really has to have some very good investigative work to begin with. And science can come in at the very end. But this is, in many ways, an incredibly complex case in which power has been brought to bear to suppress the information that's there. And, you know, you must be aware that on a ground zero level, that the people in Roswell of that time were aware that something extraordinary had occurred in their midst. And this is what I say when I'm out publicly, when they go, well, where? And I say, the general population is not that stupid. They're not that unaware. And they know when something is altering the environment they live in. If I go to an outback property and I'm dealing with someone who's grazing cattle or not even doing that, they're aware of their star field. If they're looking up in the sky and going, those stars are doing something that I've never seen before, you know that something unique is occurring. These people are very aware of their environment. And I think this is one of the major problems of governments and militaries when suppressing history, is that they don't bring into the factor that there is common sense. You don't have to be a scientist to know what's right and what's wrong. Where do we sit now? It's 2019. We have done you an injustice in many ways in dragging you away from extraordinary commitments you have in the States, and I feel...
And I love her all the more for it because she essentially, I mean, and most convincingly, realizes that this isn't just important for her husband, it's also important for her. It's important for all of us. Yeah. It's important that we know. It's important that when a government can provide 4 official explanations, in other words, choose your poison, so to speak, I'm still going to go over all the witnesses. Point. The fact that there are absolutely 0 witnesses to the subsequent 3. How foolhardy would I have to be to still argue, yeah, but I want to believe this one. I can't prove it, but I want to believe it. That makes me not only gullible, that either makes me then a willing accomplice to the deception, to the cover-up, or am I just that, again, desperate to want to believe anything but extraterrestrial? And that's where the skeptics are also, they play the wrong hand, because they'll go right to that limit. Anything but, no. And Roswell is certainly the ultimate anything but that they've had to stretch it to not only a second resolution, but then a third and a fourth, all stalling for time. Run out the clock until the final witnesses are passed on. And I've been there for those 2 last explanations. And I've worked with Congressman Stephen Schiff, and I worked with the late Senator Barry Goldwater, and I've worked as far as with the former Governor Bill Richardson of New Mexico. And I worked with Edgar Mitchell, Apollo 14, Dr. Mitchell, who walked on the moon. And we can go on and on and on, and I have 10 generals that we quote that told me that Roswell was true. The only thing we're missing is the physical proof. And then I'm the one that is still also coordinating and supervising the archaeological work. So who is performing due diligence? Who is making every effort to go where the evidence takes us? It's never been a debunker. It's never been a scoffer who says, I'll tell you what to believe. I'll tell you what you should accept. Because they do nothing. They provide nothing. And the ultimate, and here we are in 2019, and my challenge to anyone, whether you're on the fence or you just poo-poo, you dismiss this because, again, anything but extraterrestrial, you consider, if I'm wrong about all this, it changes nothing. It changes nothing. But if you're wrong, changes everything. I'd sooner be on the side of just maybe making a grandiose mistake after all this time and status quo.
Well, you know what? It's one of the most enchanting things you could ever mistake.
Yes.
But I think there's just way too many other people out there that have been affected by it, that shows signs of extreme trauma, that state this is way beyond a
To
mistake.
their deaths,
Yeah.
to their deathbeds.
This is way beyond a mistake.
And they pulled their families along
And
with them.
you have honored their lives by being
And will
tenacious
continue to.
and suffering so much assault in the public arena.
And to me, I feel as though with their passing and now with the families, Jamie, I can't tell you how often I talk to the families, how often I stay in contact with the families, how often I try to get the families to even almost like a support group, stay together, talk amongst yourselves about this, because only you people can relate, empathize, know what this is all about.
And your second last book, The Children of Roswell, that's been optioned into a series, has it? Is that
It not directly, but that will be the theme, the concept.
Right.
Focusing specifically on the Marcel family.
Right.
The name that is synonymous with the event. And then having them from episode to episode try to search and seek out their own closure in this entire affair, and then draw more and more of the other families in, meet the other families, travel to their homes, their relations, and learn between all these people who have had this shared experience of Roswell, and in many cases, only as onlookers. They weren't there. They didn't hold the wreckage in their hands. They didn't see the bodies, but they saw the torment. They saw what their fathers, their grandfathers, what their husbands lived with, what they took with them. And now they're haunted by the notion that if they don't attempt to bring some closure to what their loved ones experienced and were forced to live with all those years, that it will just continue from generation to generation. And I, for one, am going to help lead the charge. Enough is enough. Let's stop it. Let's provide them, even with some peace, some final rest, even while they're now in their graves.
You know what, I think J. Allen Hynek could be very proud of you.
Thank you. I'd like to believe that.
You know, my thought is just quickly towards the end here, Don Schmitt, you've got extraordinary skills. You're not just an incredible researcher and author, someone who can lay out a brilliant design for, you know, what we see on the screen. You're an illustrator. You're a singer. You're in a choral group. What would life, and you must have had moments where you pause and philosophically consider what life would have been like without Roswell.
Oh, my. Just as I had mentioned earlier that I have never considered quitting. I don't ever, given that it's now been half of my life devoted to, again, solving the biggest mystery of all time. How could I not? I feel more fortunate, more blessed that even as a skeptic, that I was skeptical enough that just as Dr. Hynek, and you flatter me, and I would hear it from his wife Mimi that he would be very proud of you. That to be enough of a scientist, and in my case, to be enough of an actual investigator, a researcher, that when I saw the fallacies of my ways, I changed. I changed course. Again, I went wherever I was directed, not by myself, not by my own personal inclination or my own desires or my own, my own false conviction. I allowed the cards to fall where they may. and the cards that were played by wonderful, beautiful people who just happened to be there, who just happened to be caught up in something that turned out to be nothing joyful, nothing pleasant, nothing celebrated. I mean, this could have been celebrated as one of the finest, one of the greatest moments in all of recorded history.
And it could have united humanity.
It could have united humanity.
Across socioeconomic, cultural barriers, which is what we desperately need. I don't know if you remember the incredible first season episode of Outer Limits called The Architects of Fear.
Yes, yes.
Where they actually create one of the scientists into an alien being, hoping to land him in the UN and unite humanity by us having a threat from outside of ourselves. And I don't want to even see this as a threat from outside of ourselves, because I think the greatest threat is ourselves.
It's still
to ourselves.
Yes.
You know.
And our fear, our paranoia, our lack of understanding, a
lack of compassion. And you show extraordinary compassion to those researchers. I have to show compassion to this cameraman because we are late with this interview. I wanted to say to you, and I wanted to say on camera now, and I don't know if we'll even use this, but I wanted to say the mere fact that Don Schmitt in 2019, with an extensive responsibility and a number of commitments back stateside, is sitting in the Mu-Meson Archives. Anyone who's ever been here knows that there is no money to be made here. We certainly don't have any. If you're willing to take some DVDs and videotapes, well, maybe you could build the foundations of a hut. But Don Schmitt, as far as I'm concerned, has heart and integrity, and is not motivated by money, but motivated by that desperate need to show that there are people out there that have been affected gravely by an astounding, profound experience, and they deserve so much more. And you have given them a voice. And it's through your courage. And you know what? We need to show more openness. Any detective, over the course of their work, is going to be throwing hundreds of red herrings and odd leads, and like with, you know, Kodachrome and the slides, that does not matter. The point is to stay strong and move on that line. Any good detective out there will tell you, you know, in the midst of an investigation, there is so much other material that is thrown up. The public, a small percentage will claim ownership for the most heinous crimes because of their insecurity.
Happens every day.
Yeah,
where they will have dozens of false leads that need to still be fleshed out. They still need to be investigated. And you mentioned the Kodachrome, the slides, and how that is now supposed to be like a ball and chain around my neck.
I didn't want to even bring it up because I just think it's the most absurd thing, because I think if you're doing that investigative work, this stuff is going to come up. But the problem is you're dealing with the military as well, suppressing material. The amount of disinformation they would be throwing at you is extensive.
My partner, Tom Carey, and then I could also bring in Kevin Randell as well. The number of leads, false leads, dozens that we have had through the years, and they have all been investigated because we have to. Because all it takes is that one that turns out to be genuine. And these people, again, that serve, you know, as they're nipping at our ankles constantly, who have never experienced much beyond a keyboard of a computer, who have never been in the field and have never experienced where they have been provided with a false piece of information that they still took and ran with it with the hope that it may develop into something significant. So as they've lived out their pristine, their little innocent lives where nothing negative has ever befallen them in all of their lives here on this earth, welcome to my world, because that's not what actual investigation involves. And as you mentioned, as far as in law enforcement, and if we want to draw on FBI, CIA, my God, there isn't a day that any agent working in the field hasn't been slipped a Mickey of misinformation, and they still had to check it out.
Absolutely. And we need to look at this in a holistic way. and realize there are moments where profound evidence will come up, and you've already shown us that time after time. And there are moments where what you're dealing with here might be one of the most important stories to humankind that is being suppressed continuously. There are going to be moments of extraordinary disinformation, moments of extraordinary exploitation, and there is going to be a fractured line on that research trail. And if you don't look into those leads, then you're doing an absolute disservice to the people that have suffered that suppression for years.
Exactly.
So I cannot thank you enough for your work. I think it's incredibly profound. I think that if people want to look into this event, they need to walk away from their computers, they need to read your literature, and they need to go out into the field. This is a day and age of people wanting everything on demand. They are channel surfing relationships because they are just dealing with the most restricted amount of attention and focus that they've ever had in time.
And because it requires zero effort.
Yes, yes.
And you're allowing someone else to also do all your thinking.
Let's not sink into the depths of what critical warfare was all about, which is conquering and dividing us. We should be united
Precisely.
here.
And we're not. And it's sad. But what we've just discussed sitting here this afternoon, and what you've heard me present in my talks and in my writing, is from here. It's not from anybody else, except the actual witnesses who were there.
And I think it comes from your heart as well. So thank you, Don Schmitt.
Thank you, Jamie. Wonderful.
What do you think?
I think that I should actually go undercover now. I think it's time to go into hiding, because that was an exceptional interview.
Yes,
with one of the most earnest researchers I've ever come across in my life.
Absolutely.
Just to listen to Don is an astounding thing.
It is. It is.
And I wish sometimes I would just listen and stop
Oh
interrupting.
my God, you can rant, can't you?
Yeah,
but anyway.
Good thing is that Don was certainly up to speed with my earnestness as well.
It was a bit of a battle then, wasn't it?
He is extremely passionate.
He's so passionate.
And we are so respectful of who he is and his research.
Absolutely.
I have to thank Campbell Drummond. I have to thank Don endlessly. And that was a great interview. There was a lot of insight into things I had no idea of. Oliver Stone may have ended up doing the HBO movie Roswell, but he did JFK instead. And, you know, I mean, Don was generous enough to say, thank God he did go with JFK, because that was just as significant a film in many ways.
For sure.
People go out and search for that original Roswell. I'm astounded. It's probably had a DVD release by now, but it's amazing how things like that, Intruders, the miniseries, just slip through the net. They get this sort of one broadcast moment, release on video cassette, and then they're gone. So it's important to keep an eye on all those bits of pop culture, because the truth lies within everything.
It does.
You just need to cherry pick it. Time to reconsider the way you thought about Roswell, because I think in many ways, if you start reading his books, especially Eyewitness to Roswell, you will find incredible truth in there that this may have been one of the greatest events that could have ever occurred in human history, and we're overlooking it because it remains in plain sight. Remember what Roger from MUFON told us? That some of the greatest evidence is right in front of us, and we're missing it for that very reason.
Exactly.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, you've been on a special edition of Down South Anomalies for the Untold Radio Network. We are so proud and privileged to be part of this network.
We are.
We don't want to take away from anyone else's research, but we want you to keep an open mind, wide open.
You know what? They can keep an open mind or not. It's up to them.
It
You can't tell people what to do. But
I don't intend to.
Personally, I like to have as much information from all kinds of different, sections of of the world. I can look into religion, people's that are religious, and look at their scientific, just from all cultural different perspectives, and then you can actually pick what the correlations between those things. Okay, so these people, and these people are all coming up with the same evidence. You know what I mean? No matter what their beliefs, no matter what they're into, no matter where they're from. So obviously this fact is a fact.
And I think, the great work of Paul Wallace here, the latter day Eric von Daniken, and von Daniken's sort of given him a bit of that mantle.
He has.
Along with Giorgio, because he realizes that he's doing that exact same thing, that religious myths from right across the globe, at the end of the day, all become extremely similar.
Were some sort of a fact. There was a fact in them. There was a reality to them. So,
and that's a great segue for me, because you must excuse me. The Roswell Army airfield is in New Mexico and not Mexico. I need to fact check myself all the time.
No, you didn't. You just dropped the new.
I did drop the new.
Anyway, so no, we weren't going to Mexico. We were going to New Mexico.
Yeah,
but we're actually in Sydney.
On geography. No,
you're not. You're okay. All right. Anyway. So we will be back next week with another episode. Hopefully, just as exciting and informative and entertaining. That's our aim.
We might be here with that 9-foot thermal image
we'll
of
see.
a yell.
I don't want to say who or what,
anything.
You just don't know what could happen.
What's out there? Stay
on Untold
safe,
Radio.
And thank you so much
Down
for spending
South
some
Anomalies.
time with us. I hope you've enjoyed the show, and if you have, give us a like, subscribe, and get this thing out there.
Tell
viral.
Your family, tell your friends. Tell everybody.
The COVID's not the only thing that should go viral. This network should go viral.
All right, we'll be back next week with more. Bye.
Look forward to seeing you then.